Hi, I'm Brendan Bushy.
Hi, I'm Gary Orville.
Hey Gary, how you doing?
I'm doing well. It's a cold, crisp morning up here in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. So,
Well, we're having a moderate morning, but I think in a day or two it's going to get down into the teens.
oh, is that right? I
Yeah.
was just looking at my forecast here because I got a message on my phone saying that the temperatures are going to be plummeting. So we'll be down in the minus 30s here in the next day or so.
Good luck.
Yeah, well, you get used to it. You never like it, but you get used to it.
Oh, we used to live in New Hampshire, way up north New Hampshire. It used to get sometimes minus 40 at night.
Yeah, we usually will get every winter we'll usually get about a week of that where it hits minus 40 and the last couple of years, which is really unusual, but the last couple of years when it hits minus 40, we're still getting a little bit of breeze. So minus 40 and a breeze is just unbearable.
Not a good thing. So
Anyway,
you had questions about Jimmy Carter.
I did. Of course, with President Carter's death in the past couple of days, there's been a lot of stuff in the news and whatnot about him. I was just thinking to myself that President Carter was in power in the White House when I was a teenager.
Hmm.
So I really, and I'll be honest, I didn't follow politics at all at that age. The only thing I really knew about Carter's presidency was the Iran hostage crisis because of the Canadian angle that there was with that. But everything I've ever read and heard about President Carter tells me that he was a very, very honorable, decent man in every aspect. And I was thinking to myself, that's probably true, but by the same token, my experience tells me that people don't rise to the highest levels of politics, and certainly not presidencies, um, by being meek and mild and good people all the time. So, and it's not that I'm trying to find something to tear down his legacy. I was just looking for, a little bit more rounding, I guess, of my understanding of the man. So I thought, because you and I have a history, I thought, well, I'm going to reach out to Brendan because I have a
Okay.
feeling he would probably know.
Well, I
So,
can tell you what I know or what I think.
yeah.
Um, I think it's important if you're going to understand Carter, understand when he was elected, because what we went through, I would say from 1960 on up to the election of Jimmy Carter was, I don't know what I would call it. We became a banana republic for a couple of decades. We had a president assassinated. We had his brother who was running for a president assassinated. We had civil rights leaders assassinated. It was
Hmm.
really getting wild in this country. And then we had
Hmm.
a president impeached, and he resigned, Richard Nixon. And before he resigned, his vice president resigned because he was indicted for all kinds of criminal things in his state. Then Nixon resigns. Then we had Gerald Ford come in as president. And Ford, he wasn't elected. So we had a non-elected president, and he appoints Nelson Rockefeller, I believe, as his vice president. So we had a president and a vice president who were not elected.
Hmm.
That's that sets the stage for the arrival of Jimmy Carter.
I remember as a kid, and I mean, I was a kid at the time. Um, I think I was 2 years old when Kennedy was assassinated. But I remember as a kid thinking that the U.S. seems to be nothing but political assassinations, and because that seemed to be what was going on down there at
Yeah,
all times.
I would say it was quite a time to live through. And plus we had the Vietnam War going. So
Hmm.
it was really crazy. And there were all kinds of things happening on the streets in this country. So you
Mhm.
had the anti-war movement, you had violence. I remember I lived on Long Island, so New York City was an hour's drive. And I remember the construction workers in New York City, they had a big parade through the city and they beat up people that looked like hippies on the street on the way. The police stood by. And then they marched right on up to Columbia University. In Columbia, the students were ready and they said, come on in. And that's where it stopped that day. But that kind of violence was not uncommon. And then in terms of civil rights, I remember I dropped out of college and I drove across country. I wanted to see what was going on in the country. And I went to LA, and the first place I went to LA was Watts. And Watts was
Mhm.
no longer, it looked like the picture of World War II of some little European city after it was bombed. It was in ruins. So there were things going on that were just crazy at the time. It was a lot of violence. I it I don't know what was going on behind the scenes. I don't think most of us here have a clue, but I wouldn't be surprised if there was a coup and a counter coup and a coup and another counter coup back and forth for 20 years or so. Um, Richard Nixon, he got Richard Nixon got caught basically heading up a criminal enterprise in terms of the Watergate break-in, and his attorney
Mhm.
general was involved in it. So his attorney, a lot of Nixon's cabinet, when Nixon left, were indicted and convicted and went to jail, including his attorney general. So this was the country that the election, right, for
Mhm.
Jimmy Carter
Yeah.
takes place. Um, when
It's
he
very
ran,
different. Yeah, it would be very, very different. Of course, I've read and learned all that, but it's very different, doing it, 20 years after the fact versus actually living through it.
well, I remember when I lived up in California, I was working up in Northern California, uh, in Coloma, which was in Garden Valley, um, where Sutter discovered gold. And I was working at a place called the Gold Bar Ranch. And I left to come back to New York. And one of the guys I was working with gave me a note that if I could go back, when I go back to New York, if I could drive in the village and see if I could find his former girlfriend, who he thought was waitressing at one of the cafes there. And I said, I'll
Right.
take a shot. So I got back. And the next night, I drive in. I have a little Falcon, right? A
Hmm.
Falcon. And I'm in Greenwich Village. And I'm looking, trying to get myself, I knew the village. I'm getting myself oriented. I'm trying to find this particular cafe. And I look down the block, and there's just a rolling mob coming at me. I don't know how to describe it. I've never been in this situation before, but it's coming at me. And on my side, between me and the mob, are mounted police officers. So there's a skirmish going on. And but the last thing between me and the mob, the police officer, I couldn't move the car. Right? There was no, and I just happened to be at the intersection where this thing was coming down to the street I was on, and I couldn't back up. I couldn't go forward. I couldn't go right. Couldn't go left. And then the mob hit my car, and the police horse and the officer fell onto the hood of my car. That was, that was an experience. It was crazy times here. That mob, by the way, was about it was at the police raided a club for homosexuals in Greenwich Village,
Hmm.
and it turned into a a big, free for all. Everybody was blasting everybody else. So it was the times in New York or in the United States were really crazy. I remember coming home when I lived on the island. I was in college, and one of my friends comes home and he's bleeding all over. Um, he was stopped by a cop, pulled out of the car, and beaten up. It was, and probably because of maybe he had a peace sticker on the car or something like that. So this country was in a lot of turmoil. And I don't think anybody
Hmm.
in this country knew what was really going on. When Carter ran, and I was a Democrat, I voted for
Hmm.
Carter, but I didn't know who the hell Jimmy Carter was. Nobody I knew who Jimmy Carter was. And I was involved in politics. And one of the people I was involved with, a friend of mine, was involved in the Suffolk County Democratic Party, which is where we lived in Suffolk
Right.
County, New York. And he had been an organizer for the Liberal Party in Manhattan. If you read some New York City politics history, you find his
Mhm.
name. But so he came out and understand this, the Liberal Party in Manhattan was a bit of a game, as was the Conservative Party. So you had the
Mhm.
liberals, the conservatives, the Democrats, the Republicans, right?
Okay.
But a lot of times the person who ran as the Democrat also ran as the liberal, and same with the Republicans. So things were crazy, right? You didn't really necessarily understand what was going on or why. And his name was Jerry, and he said to me, I said, Jerry, what the hell is going on? He said, Brendan, he said, we've reached a point like of turmoil. It's like a pressure cooker, and the lid is secure, and the fire is raging below, and this thing's going to blow wide open unless something happens to bring it all down. And Jimmy Carter is the something that can happen to bring it all down because no one knows him. The intrigue will stop for a while. Things will calm down. So the people, the leadership of the Democratic Party is moving toward Carter or willing to support him simply to just bring things back to a reasonable level of sanity in the society. And so he got elected, and no one knew really, no one knew who he was. And to for a lot of people, it was like a joke because he had his brother Billy. Billy
Mhm.
Carter was selling Billy beer. His
Right.
mother was, she was sitting making statements every now and then, just which were crazy. And the press was reporting all of this. So it looked like, I don't know, Jed Clampett moved into the White House
Right.
as opposed to Beverly Hills. you know. So but he seemed to be a nice guy. Now, the other thing I can tell you, back in the day, Kathy and I, we were at a friend's house in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Mhm.
And we were there, and it was a large family gathering, and it wasn't our family, it was friends. And
Mhm.
there were two guys there that were they were United States Army, but they were a special branch. And I don't remember if they were like Rangers. I know they weren't Green Berets or something like that, but or maybe they were a Special Forces division within um,
Right.
the Army. And this was after Carter. This was back when right after we went into Iraq and took over Iraq, and Saddam Hussein
Mhm.
was, he disappeared for a while. And they were talking, and we got to talking about Carter. And they were saying he's the worst president we ever had. And I
Mhm.
was like, what's your basis? And they were like, you don't understand. And these guys, they were telling stories about how when they entered one of Saddam's palaces, they had
Mhm.
access to everything. They were sitting behind his desk, smoking his cigars, drinking his wine, things like that. But they were in like early into that to secure certain things before they got lost. A lot of it
Mhm.
had to do with securing information, intelligence, stuff like that. So these guys, this wasn't their first, go around. They had been in other countries doing similar things, but they really had animosity toward Jimmy Carter. And when I asked why, they were like, he he he, he didn't stand up. He didn't defend us. And I was like, what did you want him to do? And they were like, well, he didn't go
Hmm.
into Iran. He didn't, free the hostages. I said he tried. And they said, well, he didn't. And I said, well, did you get any credit for trying? No. Um, Now, I guess there's more to this because I was listening to something the other day and someone was talking literally about that. And he said when Carter finally put that together, he wanted the forces going in to use rubber bullets because he didn't want
Oh.
anybody killed.
Hmm.
Right. And I'm thinking, okay, now, so maybe, and I didn't know this when I was talking to these guys at this party, but maybe from their perspective, if they're being sent in special forces rescue mission, they don't want rubber bullets in the guns,
No, no. Yeah.
So,
Yeah, to go
but
into a situation like that with non-lethal weaponry doesn't seem to make a lot of sense.
right. So, but and I don't know about any of that. I'm just sharing little anecdotes. I'll get to Carter in a second. But so he was kind of an enigma. I don't think
Hmm.
we ever had a president like Jimmy Carter before, at least not in my lifetime or as far back as I can go. I don't remember reading about anybody like him. I think he was a Christian. Um, I mean, I know he was a Christian. He says he was a Christian. Everybody says he was a Christian, but I think he might have been the genuine article. I
Hmm.
don't know. I think he walked the walk. He didn't just talk the talk. So, and
Everything I've ever seen would suggest that that's correct. He seemed to be um, the genuine article. There was you could believe what he said and how he lived. So.
well, the other thing I remember, just jumping, he had a
Hmm.
daughter, Amy, who was a teenager,
Hmm.
and he let her go to public school in Washington, D.C. And that would have not been the case if they were living back in Plains, Georgia, or wherever they would have been living. She would not have been going to a local public school, especially in Washington, D.C.
Hmm.
And I think she got sort of adopted. Uh, I'm trying to think that Jerry Rubin and the other fellow who were part of the Chicago 7 trial, they hooked up
Hmm.
with her. Um, I don't think anything bad happened to her at all, but I think he was like really um, second guessing himself on the decision as to whether or not Amy should be going to public school. But I think he felt, and it wasn't just he, both he and his wife felt that the president of the United States, they should demonstrate their support for local government, for the community. So they sent Amy to public school. I think later he regretted that, but there's that. But to Carter, the when we were in New Hampshire, there was a very conservative radio station that I used to listen to, and it was a call in. I would call in occasionally, and they were trashing Jimmy Carter. So it was the first time I got in any kind of a public discussion about Jimmy Carter, and it was on a radio. And they were just going on about being a governor does not prepare you to be the president. He was unprepared. He was a lousy president, this, that. And I called in and I said, I said, I'm listening to you. Kind of one-sided take on your side, but um, from where I'm sitting, he's the only president we've had that negotiated any kind of a successful peace treaty in the Middle East. So he got the PLO and Egypt to the
Hmm.
bargain. He went to Camp David and they hammered out an agreement and it lasted. I said that I think is quite an accomplishment. And they were left speechless, right? They didn't expect anybody to call in, but if someone was going to call in, they thought maybe they'd be arguing Democrats, Republicans. And I brought up a topic that what were they going to say? Yeah, he did that and it sucked. No, they couldn't say it. So that was just a little piece there. But during that time, we had the hostages, right, who were
Right.
being held. Carter would not campaign. He thought it was improper to campaign for office while there were Americans being held hostage in another country. That, I think, was a bad decision. And I think
Hmm.
that is contributes a lot to why he lost the election. That wasn't the whole thing. But the other thing we had
Hmm.
happening, we had gas rationing. So
Right.
you had depended on whether you had an even number or odd number license plate number, you could
Hmm.
get gas on certain days. So there were long gas lines. That was something I guess I never experienced. But prior to me, my parents maybe had more experience with rationing during World War
Hmm.
II.
Hmm.
But I don't know what that was like. I can tell you it was not pleasant in, in where I was. The
Yeah. Up.
lines.
Yeah. We never had that I recall in Canada, but I do remember seeing, the long lines of gas in the U.S. on the news. Back in those days, the news came on at 6 o'clock and 11 o'clock at night. That was, about the
Well,
only
I
access you
remember sitting in those lines. It's a crazy,
had.
crazy experience. The um the other thing Carter did, which I didn't know about at the time, I knew about later, was he refused to give aid to leaders of foreign countries that were subjugating their people in violent ways.
Okay. Yeah.
So that changed for his 4 years in office. That changed, as I understand it, our entire way of doing business with foreign governments. Because
Well, it
we were
would.
paying a lot of brutal dictators
Hmm.
for whatever reason. I don't care what the reason was. We were paying them and they were killing their people. Um,
Hmm.
so, and then he returned the Panama Canal to the
Hmm.
people of Panama, which seemed like a reasonable thing for someone to do. So if you tune out all the negative things people say about him, he
Right.
seemed like a decent guy. Right? He was trying to do the right thing. He didn't want to be involved with causing people's deaths. So he was going to order a raid to free hostages, and they had to use rubber bullets.
Hmm.
He returned the Panama Canal to Panama. It's like it was their canal, right? Their country. He refused to give money to brutal dictators. That's all to the good from where I'm sitting. I think he was.
Hmm.
I'm guessing. I have no clue. I never met him, but I think he was really motivated by his beliefs, his religious beliefs. But I also don't think he was
Hmm.
trying to impose his religious beliefs on anybody else. So I
No,
think he
no.
was like he accepted people for who they were, and he took
Hmm.
his responsibility as president very seriously, and
Hmm.
he made decisions based upon his sense of what was right and wrong as opposed to what was politically expedient at the time.
Hmm.
That's my
Hmm.
take.
But stuff that, depending upon your political bent, I guess, um, the stuff that uh, we give Carter credit for could easily be argued that it was a very negative thing for the U.S. So I can certainly see where he would have a lot of opposition from the Republican Party as well, because that would certainly not have been, their preferred method of dealing with with things.
Well,
So,
it wasn't necessarily the preferred method for the Democratic Party either. The
oh, fair enough. Yeah.
I remember when the one of our ships was taken off Japan. It was seized. I can't remember the name of it, but it was seized, brought to I think to China, and it was a spy ship, right? So it wasn't a warship. It had
Okay.
electronics, but it was in international waters. And I believe the Chinese
Hmm.
took it, brought, I think Bucha was the captain of it. I don't remember, but it was, and that was held, right? They had the ship and everything. And my take, and I was, a peace organizer, was that the responsible thing for our government to do would have been to just send everything in and free that ship and its crew. And not,
Hmm.
and I wasn't looking at that from uh, a moral perspective other than that we have a responsibility to the troops we send into action. And if
I
we
agree.
put them in harm's way, we need to support them. And if someone commits a criminal act at sea and takes them, we need to go and take them back. So
Yeah.
that would, now that that didn't happen under Jimmy Carter. It would happen to another president, but Jimmy Carter, I doubt he would have looked at that as a way of returning the crew. And even in
Hmm.
Iran, when they took the hostages, I think all of us kind of expected that we would just send it. That was an act of war. That was our embassy.
Hmm. Oh, without
So,
a doubt.
send in the troops, right?
Hmm.
He didn't. But on the other hand, all of the things we did, all of our policies, our foreign policies, led to ruin for a lot of the world and for us as well. Okay, so
Hmm.
when we backed the Shah in Iran, right, and Iran had an elected leader
Hmm.
prior to the Shah, and he was removed by our CIA. I mean, that's,
Hmm.
one of the best kept secrets, right? Where is this Maxwell Smart's apartment? No, you want the spy. He's on the second floor. So it was like, yeah, the CIA took out the democratically elected leader in Iran. We put in the Shah. The Shah was a brutal dictator. He
Hmm.
killed thousands and thousands of his people. We supported him, right?
Hmm.
We funded him. And look what happened, because eventually he's going to be deposed. And when he's deposed, not only do you get a different regime coming in there, a non-democratic regime, but you get a
Hmm.
regime that hates the United States, heading up a country where the whole population hates the United States because we put a brutal dictator in charge for years. So I don't think our ways of dealing with things worked for us in the long run. I
Hmm.
think maybe Carter had a better idea, but
Hmm.
it never had a chance. I mean, or no one ever really gave it serious consideration. It was like, okay, Carter's out now. We can get back to doing business as normal.
Right. Yeah.
If
There was
you,
always the story with the Iran hostages that Reagan had negotiated behind the scenes with Iran to ensure that the hostages wouldn't be released until he took office.
that's right.
Was
And
that
the first thing they did was release the hostages,
absolutely? Yeah.
literally that night.
Yeah.
And, I think, excuse me, here's Reagan basically conspiring with the foreign enemy who's holding hostages to not release them earlier because he wanted to it worked for him politically in terms of getting
Right.
elected, and then after he was elected, in terms of presenting an image of himself,
Hmm.
to the American people.
Yeah. Look
The
what I did, and Carter couldn't do it.
Yeah, and but that's not unique. I don't like Henry Kissinger. Henry Kissinger is right up near the top of people I think, have made the world miserable. But Henry Kissinger, Nixon appointed Henry Kissinger as Secretary of State, and he did so on recommendation of Nelson Rockefeller, who was governor of New York at the time. Rockefeller
Hmm.
was a big Kissinger supporter. And Kissinger went out and was negotiating a peace with North Vietnam. And
Okay.
Nixon stopped it because he didn't want Kissinger to get the credit for negotiating the peace. So, so the war went on a little longer than it needed to. I don't know whether it was another year or so, simply over something like that. So there's our politics is, uh, if you really get into our politics, leaders here doing business with foreign leaders, look, my God, look at Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Right? Right?
Mhm.
Donald Trump, his his agenda the first time around, he was looking to, help sort of break up the European Union, take down NATO. Um,
Mhm.
he looked to stop any aid to Ukraine in resisting Russia. So our presidents have gotten involved with foreign
Mhm.
leaders inappropriately, going
Yeah.
back as long as you can imagine.
And I firmly believe we've only seen the tip of the iceberg of the cooperation Trump is going to give to Putin.
Yeah.
I think there's a whole big change coming in the world, and it's going to be, I have a strong suspicion it's going to be Russia and the US against the world.
Well, I have no, the only thing I'm relatively sure of, and I'm not a gambler, so, but I'm relatively sure that things are going to change dramatically over the next 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure that people have a clue just how dramatic those changes are going to be or how it's going to impact their lives. I think a lot of people who were voting for Trump are going to basically be betrayed.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing about Trump, he's not, unlike a first term president, he's not at all concerned about reelection.
Mm-hmm.
So he can do whatever he wants because he doesn't have to worry about not getting reelected. On the other hand, I think it's perfectly reasonable to assume that he's going to do whatever he can to change the things so that he could have a third term or something of that nature. But Trump,
Without a doubt.
yeah, um he's pretty free to do whatever the hell he
Mhm.
wants. Carter,
Well, and he seems to be making sure that he's got nobody around him that will put any brakes on him.
yeah, I don't think
He has surrounded himself with nothing but his strongest supporters that will either A, see the world the way he sees it, or B, allow him to do whatever the heck he wants. I think that's one of the things that Trump learned from his first term was that, there was too many adults in the room for him.
well, he
There
didn't
was
pick
too
his
many people
cabinet.
saying
Trump,
no and
Trump didn't pick
stopping
his
him.
cabinet. Trump did not expect to win. He didn't have a transition team in place. The Republican Party provided him with his cabinet officers, and he chose them, and they kept leaving because they couldn't stand him or what he was doing.
Mhm.
But this time around, he's picking his cabinet. So there's that. The other thing, by the way, about Reagan coming in, Reagan did another thing. Jimmy Carter put solar panels on the White House,
Yes.
right? So he was introducing us to solar energy, and the gas, corporations were
Mhm.
going berserk, oil corporations. And one of the first things I remember seeing the newsreel Reagan did was had the solar panels
Yep.
removed, but not only removed, but just like dumped. And
Hmm.
he was standing like,
Oh,
this
it was
is,
a statement.
yeah, it was like, this ain't happening anymore. Um, so yeah, I think, I don't think Carter engaged in the kind of relations with foreign leaders that other presidents we've had uh,
Hmm.
did. I think he was pretty sincere. I don't know. I don't, at least he had principles. Whether
Hmm.
you agreed with his principles or not, it's certainly different than, say, someone like Joel Osteen, who has a mega, church
Right.
out in Texas who's just taking money, or certainly different than Donald Trump, who's selling Bibles with the American flag on it.
Hmm.
It's he had genuine principles, and I think he tried to live according to those principles. He got in a lot of trouble
Hmm.
when he did an interview. I don't know if you remember this with Playboy magazine.
Vaguely. I don't recall the specifics of the details
Uh,
of it.
he did an interview with Playboy, and
Okay.
the Christians went crazy just that he would do it. But in the interview, they asked him, I guess, about things like having affairs and stuff like that. And mind you,
Hmm.
um, a lot of our presidents, like, you know, exceed when it comes to affairs and sexual intrigues. But he said, no, I'm married. This is what I believe. This is my responsibility to my wife. But they asked him, well, don't you ever see a woman and have lust? He said something like, yeah, I have lust in my heart sometimes, but I don't act on it. It's my responsibility as a Christian to, sort of mitigate the emotions I'm experiencing at any given moment.
Right.
They went crazy all over him because he said he had lust in his heart and because he did an interview with Playboy. I mean,
Hmm.
so it's, it's when you talk about Jimmy Carter, he really is an anomaly, and he
Well,
managed to upset everybody one way or the other at any given time, including
right.
the Christians. It's
He
and
was a
he
very interesting man. I mean, what most of my knowledge and understanding of him was well after his presidency, and his work with Habitat for Humanity and those types of things. You know, tell me that yes, this guy walked the talk. But at the same time, I was too young, too naive, and just really didn't care enough at the time when he was president to really be paying a whole lot of attention. So I was just looking for some input and some perspective on the man. I think he deserves all of the respect that he's being given, and I've never thought anything else. But I really, again, didn't understand much of what was going on in the world at the time. I had was more interested in getting a driver's license and making a couple of bucks to go out on the
Well,
weekend.
trust me, those of us here in the United States who were old enough didn't understand what was going on either. It was not, I still don't know what's going on. I, you know,
Fair enough. Yeah, there was a very turbulent time. I mean, just from the on the perimeter. I mean, it just seemed like the U.S. was just in constant uh, chaos at that point in time. And again, I mean, a lot of this stuff didn't affect us directly in Canada. And number two, I've got to, I looked at it from the perspective of I was being raised in a small town in Western Canada. So, I mean, I was about as far removed from this stuff as you could possibly get. So, and my parents were not political people, so it wasn't something that was discussed at the dinner table. So it was just kind of gleaning the odd news headline when I was inclined to read a newspaper, which I'll be honest wasn't very often when when I was 15 years old. So
well, Canada back in the day, that was the premier destination for people who were fleeing the draft in this country.
yeah, yeah.
So, and there's been a lot of influence, I think, from people coming down from Canada, especially in music, um,
Hmm.
and in supporting the anti-war movement here
Hmm.
at different times. So Canada was affected in some way.
Uh, Without a doubt. But it was affected a long ways from where where I was
Right,
living at the time.
right.
And anything that seemed to be going on in Canada at the time was Toronto, Montreal. I mean, those were 4,000 miles away from where I lived, and I lived in a small agricultural community of 5,000 people.
Wow.
That was kind of in the middle of, uh, I'm going to say the middle of nowhere. It's not in the middle of nowhere anymore, but at the time it was because there really wasn't much uh, for highways and roads. The city that I spent a lot of time in as I got a little bit older, just because it was um, a bigger community. I think Prince Albert was like 35 or 40,000 people at the time, and it had theaters and shopping malls and all that kind of stuff. And it was about a 45-minute drive away when I was in my late teens. As a kid, before that highway was put in, it was a 90-minute drive on virtually all gravel
All
roads.
right.
So you didn't get out of town very often.
Well, you
Uh,
probably have a lot in um, similar in terms of where you were raised as opposed to where Jimmy Carter was raised, because I think Plains,
mhm.
Georgia only had about 5,000 people,
Yeah, it's a small community from what I can understand.
and it was
Very,
farming, and
yeah,
and he
yeah.
was a peanut farmer. Um,
Hmm.
he married Rosalind. They were married for, I don't know, 75 years or more. It,
Hmm.
I'm curious, where you came from, was there a strong religious bond within the community?
Um, Within pockets, I think. It wasn't really an overlying thing within the community. Everybody sort of had their churches and whatnot. So yeah, I wouldn't, and it was very diverse as far as the religions that were within the community. But of course, at that point in time in the 60s, I mean, they were all some version of the Christian denomination, and the province that I lived in, Saskatchewan. A lot of their laws were very much beholden to, Christian ethics and Christian beliefs. For instance, well, I think that was probably everywhere, but when I was a kid, I mean, everything in town was locked down tight on Sunday. Like, I think the only things that were allowed to be open were gas stations and restaurants. That was it. Um, so there
Huh.
was a lot of that stuff. If you were and in my community, we used to joke about it, but it was the truth. If you were the new kid in school in grade two, you were still the new kid in school in grade 12.
Right.
There just it was an agriculture community, and there just wasn't a lot of people that moved in and out. It was that changed later on as the community. My hometown really hasn't grown a whole bunch, but it has really more significantly diversified away from agriculture. And then the provincial government back in the 70s did basically they decentralized all of the government services. So while they had previously, all the government services had all been housed and officed in the capital city of Regina, they decided that wasn't fair and they dispersed them all throughout the province. So my community got, and I can't remember which, but we got a couple of different uh, government offices brought into the community, which helped diversify the population a little bit because now you get people moving in and out, and there's all, of course, the peripheral positions that come with that. But yeah, still very much. The last time I was back was probably about 15 years ago for my dad's funeral. I don't know. Didn't I still knew my way around, and it still looked kind of the same, and didn't recognize any of the people on the street anymore. But there's not much that had changed.
Well, one glaring difference between your small
Hmm.
agricultural community and Plains, Georgia, was Plains, Georgia, prior to the Civil War, slavery was there was a uh,
Hmm.
there was a social structure and
Yeah.
and it was imposed on Plains, Georgia, and all the states in the South. But slavery was legal, and Jimmy Carter, as I understand it, was raised in a diversified community, but was separated, right? It was
Okay.
so he it was not like he never saw a black person. He saw them every day, but there were different social classes. As I understand it, again, from
Hmm.
hearing someone talk the other day, all of his friends as a child were black. So he was not exactly typical of
Right.
people come. I guess going back to his belief, he he believed, people were people and
Hmm.
deserved love and respect simply for the fact that they were alive.
Hmm.
But I don't know. But that's all I got. You got anything else on this?
No, that was it. It was a. I appreciate the opportunity to have a chat. It's definitely added to my understanding of the man, and uh, I get curious about these things as I become much more um, interested and involved in politics. I get and the world around me generally. Started to get curious about stuff that happened before I started taking an interest in it. And you can read stuff, but by the same token, it's not the same as talking to someone. Because when I'm reading something, I don't know whether it's just the cynic in me, but I'm always trying to figure out, okay, well, what angle, what are they trying to not necessarily sell, but they're definitely trying to sell a perspective. And
Yeah.
whether that's right, wrong, or different, I don't know. And if you don't know anything about a topic, and if you're trying to learn it, um, you don't know whether you're being sold a bill of goods or not. So
Well, I think we're all
I find
probably
it's just
getting
better to
sold
have a conversation.
a bill of goods from our politicians.
Oh, without a doubt, without a doubt. Uh, I've learned though to maybe get it from a few different sources and a few different angles before you before you make a decision as to what's right or wrong.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
and I think in this day of social media and stuff, you know, unfortunately, I think one of the biggest things that I see is that people just surround themselves with stuff that they agree with. They're just looking for somebody to say, yes, you are correct, and away they go. That's about as much thought as gets put into it, and that's where the Fox Newses of the world do very, very well with brainwashing people.
just one last thing.
Yeah.
Apparently Trump lost a decision the other day on the rape case.
Yes.
And
Yes.
the judge reaffirmed that technically he committed rape. Because in New York
Right.
State, where the case was, if you do certain things,
Yeah.
it's considered rape. So I'm just
Hmm.
wondering if you have any thoughts on why CBS, or was it CBS? No, ABC settled with Trump.
ABC. Yeah. Settled. The only thing that I can think of with that, and when I was reading about the decision that they made to settle, I think they're absolutely scared shitless, for lack of a better term, that Trump is going to start taking away broadcasting licenses. And they're doing whatever they have to do to kiss the ring.
You know,
And
every time you
because it makes no sense it makes no sense from a legal standpoint that they would have settled. They were completely in the right.
well, every time you take a step backwards, right?
Hmm.
It's like if you were playing a game of football and you were at the 10-yard line and all of a sudden you kept losing yardage, you'd be at the other end of the field. You'd be so far from your goal, it would be ridiculous,
Hmm.
right? But that seems to be the way politicians and corporate entities are dealing with Donald Trump. They just keep taking a step back. But the more they
Hmm.
take back, the farther they have to go to just get where they were.
Well, and not only that, but they set the expectation that they will be pushed around. I mean, when you keep giving in on everything, well, okay, if you gave in on this, well, let's see if you'll give in on that. Where does it end? Um,
Well,
Trump is in a
if you
bit of a battle with Canada right now over tariffs, dictating our because he doesn't like our border policy, which, who the hell what that's all about. But, you know, but as far as I'm concerned, you stand up to this guy because if he gets away with dictating what our border policies are going to be, and quite frankly, I mean, our border policies aren't perfect. Nobody's are, but they aren't that bad. Um, if he gets away with that, well, what's he going to dictate next time? Like, enough is enough. And just nip it in the bud as far as I'm concerned.
well, I think
Oh,
the last thing I could say on Carter is he seems to be the antithesis of Donald Trump,
hmm. In
right? I
every
mean,
respect.
in every single possible respect, right?
Hmm.
I, it's like Carter is a person who had moral beliefs and tried to live up to them, and Trump
Yeah.
is a person who has no moral beliefs at all.
Also,
And
no moral boundaries as far as I'm concerned. So there's, it's, I think every decision he makes is, what is going to benefit me in the moment. And as president, I don't even think his thought process goes to what benefits the country. It's still what benefits me. So, uh, yeah, it's going to be an interesting 4 years.
well, maybe we can start as things progress. We can have little chats like this,
I
compare
have a feeling
notes.
that there's going to be a lot of material coming.
Yeah, I think so. The
All right.
especially if he goes to take to, to induce you folks to give up your nationhood and become a 51st state of the United States.
Well, I'm wondering whether it's going to be us or Panama or Greenland that he takes on first. So who the hell knows?
I don't know. But you really have to respect someone like Zelensky in Ukraine with how he's stood up to Russia,
Mhm.
right? I mean,
Yep.
so yeah, if there's a role model out there in terms of you talk about people here giving in, just caving in, look at
Yep.
Zelensky. He
Yep.
he's been going on for years. He's been resisting them, and he's been making progress. And he looks like he'd pull it off too. Uh, except Trump got elected, and God knows what'll happen now if the
Well,
supplies
I'm
go
very
off.
afraid that Trump is just going to be pulling all the support. I mean, Ukraine has done a miraculous job of holding off Russia, but it's because of the support that they've been getting from, the other countries in the world, especially the NATO countries. And I also have a strong suspicion that the U.S. is going to get pulled out of NATO under Trump because he seems to have no respect or use for that. Or for the alliances that are in place. So
Well,
it's going to be
it's
interesting times.
yeah, yeah. The Chinese blessing and curse. May you live in interesting times, right? It's like
You'll live in interesting times for
we
sure.
live certainly in interesting times.
We
Anyway,
certainly are. Anyway,
uh,
take care. Thank
take
you
care.
very much for the time.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Enjoy talking to you. Talk to you
All
again
right.
soon, hopefully. Take
Sounds
care.
good. Thanks, Brenda.
Bye.
Bye bye.